drugs came into the picture from antivirals, antihelminthics, antiparasitics, anti-inflammatory, anticoagulants, vitamins, minerals, many more. You name any drug, all came and they took a pendulum of circles in them. But we still are struggling to get a specific pharmacological therapy. The most common cause of mortality in the COVID patients is severe ARDS and hypoxemic respiratory failure, which is a leading cause of death, even though we see it involving multi-systems. But the most common cause why we lose the patients is a severe ARDS in them. For right now, at this point of time, even after the 8, 9 months of this unprecedented pandemic, even in India, in different states of the India and even in Kerala, now we have only the high quality critical care or high quality respiratory support remain the only mainstay of therapy. Rest all play a supplemental role. Oxygen supplementation or some form of non-invasive support like high flow nasal cannulas, invasive mechanical ventilation or non-invasive mechanical ventilation remain the mainstay till now. If you see the earlier reports from Italy and earlier part of the pandemic when we have gone through this in March and April, we have seen that those patients who goes into a state of requiring invasive or non-invasive ventilation, the mortality remained very high. Weaning was a difficulty and the ventilation days remained to be prolonged. These are the COVID which have gone through from the last 8 months. What is our experience is the course of respiratory illness, as we all know, all the COVID pneumonic patient or the COVID respiratory illness doesn't seem to have the similar course. Many remain asymptomatic, many remain mild, many remain moderate and they recover well after hospitalization and oxygen supplementation. But there are some correlations when a patient comes with more severe infection and a very bad host response to that infection and have a little physiological reserve in the form of elderly patients or underlying some chronic lung issues or having a multiple comorbidities, the course of this respiratory illness in COVID patient becomes little difficult or more turbulent. I again remind you that the severity of the infection, the way the host responds to it, the physiological reserve the patient is having, and the add-on comorbidity the patient is having, that decides the course. We have seen the patient who have all these factors, the course becomes more turbulence in them. Once these patients get admitted to the hospital, the response to any form of supplementation, either oxygen supplementation, non-invasive supplementations, or a ventilatory support response, also we have seen the responsiveness also decides the course in the future. And again, we have seen one more factor which played a role. The patients who presented to us late after the onset of the disease, after probably a week or 10 days, they are at home, they are trying to fix the problems and they were trying to get some supplemental oxygen at home. And later on, they actually deteriorated and they presented to us in a sicker state. They had a turbulent course in the hospital or worse outcomes. In the beginning of the pandemic, if you remember, many of us must have been heard these words L type, H type by the great Gaetano. What he actually initially thought about is the L type, the initial part, where we have a very good compliance, very low elastance, which we know. There is a little recruitability, but there is another phenotype called H type, where there is a high elastance and very bad compliant lung, which we generally see. These are the two phenotypes which we came across in the early part, like in the April and May, and which was told to us that probably the ARDS in which we are dealing nowadays in COVID may be different from a regular ARDS, which we have seen in influenza or any bacterial pneumonia. And these L type, which has a good compliance and low recruitability, slowly progresses to H type because of the patient's self-induced lung injury, or over a time when the disease gets severe, they get into the H type. But these were the earlier part of the pandemic, these concepts were thrown, and we thought this probably is a different phenotype from the regular ARDS. But over the last 8 to 9 months, what we have come across is the typical phenotype which is described in April and May may not be the typical true, but it varies with from patient to patient. And as in the later part, we realized that this is a similar part of ARDS which we see with any other diseases like in influenza or other. The typical pathophysiology which we see in any ARDS patient, that is the non-hydrostatic pulmonary edema. This is a non-hydrostatic pulmonary edema, that is ARDS, because of increased permeability of the membrane, causing the alveolars flooded with inflammatory mediators and fluid without a failure heart or without any change in the pressures. But what is it different from the other pathophysiology of ARDS is the pulmonary intravascular coagulopathies. The coagulopathies which we have seen in micro and macro vessels of both the lung and other parts of the body was a typical in this kind of ARDS, which is added to our VQ mismatch and added further worsening in us. Let me actually take few cases which will give us more idea. Suppose a patient who actually presented to us, a 46 years male patient presented to us with a typical fever, cough, and COVID-19 RT-PCR was positive outside. And he also undergone a chest X-ray outside on day 7. And it was leveled, the disease was leveled as CORAD 6 because he had a very bad chest with CORAD 5 and a RT-PCR positive. So he goes to CORAD 6. And the city severity index is around 16 by 40. That is multi-system, multiple segments were involved. And typically this patient had, other than fever, cough, had no other symptoms of breathlessness. So he was then put onto a home isolation by his family physician, and he was under the monitoring, the remote monitoring from a hospital. He was under the pulse oximeter monitoring, which we typically many of us recommend. She noticed that his saturations are dipping to 90s to 92. But he had no SOB, no distress. He is again doing his regular activity at home. So these are a kind of happy hypoxemia, which generally we see in patients in a younger age group like this. Because of his hypoxemia, this patient was advised to visit a hospital, and we visited our hospital because of ongoing hypoxemia and low saturations. This patient was admitted to the room side, and this patient received a standard COVID therapy in the last couple of months, antivirals, even though the antivirals are under scanner now, and anticoagulants and steroids, and put onto a very low flow 2 liters oxygen with nasal prongs maintaining a saturation of 94, which generally happens in many of our settings in a room side. On day 2, his oxygen requirement is slowly climbed up from 2 liters to 4 liters to 6 liters and saturating around 90%. And in this period of the 2 days, this patient was asked for self-proning. On day 4, he was requiring 12 liters of oxygen on a non-rebreathing mask to maintain a saturation of 90. He started with 2 liters, slowly climbed up to 12 liters to maintain a saturation of 90. He was a little tachypneic, 20 to 25 respiratory rate per minute. He had some effort intolerance whenever he was moving out of the bed for a simple reason, for his urination or his position change, he started desaturating. And his repeat CT on day 4 of hospital admission or day 11 of total disease was showing worsening of severity. And the biomarkers which we generally do, like D-dimer, LDH, and his CRPs and his other markers were on rising trend. This patient, because of ongoing hypoxemia requiring a very higher oxygen requirement, was shifted to high dependency unit in critical care area. The high dependency units come under critical care areas, and in critical care areas, the critical care clinician felt this patient probably will need some form of HFNC support, non-invasive support for his comfort, and the HFNC at a 40 liters with 60% FiO2 was started, and he saturated 92. He was advised for a self-proning. After starting HFNC, this patient looked little stable, and was doing by his own self-proning. So to actually go through a flow, a patient who presents to the hospital, a patient who presents to the hospital, if he doesn't need any immediate intubation, as in our case, this patient was only asymptomatic and was only hypoxic and was happy at home, but because of the monitoring, he was shifted here. Initially, we try a low flow systems, either by nasal prongs or by a oxygen mask. And if the patient is requiring more than 8 liters of oxygen, then we switch to non-rebreathing mask. We generally tend to encourage a awake proning in them. And if the patients are saturating below 92, or they are having a tachypnea, or they require more than 12 liters on a near non-breathing mask on a self-proning, we recommend available, if you are available, a high flow nasal cannula, and we titrate accordingly. So this is how a high flow nasal cannula come into play. So if low flow systems, non-rebreathing mask fails, and you have a high flow nasal cannula, patient is awake, cooperative, normal hemodynamics, without any urgent indication for intubation, there is no hypercapnic respiratory failure, we prefer high flow nasal cannulas as an initial choice of non-invasive supports in them. And what we believe is the aerolization is less, comfort to the patient is good, humidification helps, a around 40 to 60 liters flow with a closed mouth gives around 5 to 6 millimeters of PEEP, and this humidification gives soothing. He can take he can actually take oral feeds and diet, and they also can comfortably try to change their position. For regarding the airborne precautions or aerosolized related precautions, we tend to put a mask on them, generally a surgical mask, and sometimes normal Hudson mask without any flow. We also try to keep on their face so that the aerolization doesn't happen in them. Let us come to a second case. All cases don't behave in the same way, that you take 5-7 days of time and then you try to go from one phase of low flow oxygen to non-rebreathing mask, then HFNC. Look at this patient. This patient presented to us with a severe respiratory distress with detected diabetes in hospital. He was never been a diabetic before. In the hospital, his sugars were very high and found to have a CORAD 5 in the emergency CT, and severity scoring was around 24 out of 50 out of 40, and he was saturating 76 on room air and was actually tachypneic at a 40 respiratory rate per minute. In ER, in emergency department, this patient was put onto a non-rebreathing mask of 15 liters just as an immediate rescue. And this patient was saturating around 88 with the ABG showing PF ratios less than 50, in fact, not even 100. He was in severe respiratory distress. He was using all his accessory muscles. He was actually breathing very hard. Worker breathing looks very hard. A dual limb NIV support was attempted in ER with a FiO2 of 100% to bridge an intubation. In that short period of NIB till we actually are ready with an intubation process, he was generating a tidal volume of 900 ml. Why I'm trying to inform you this is, even though we give for 10 minutes or 5 minutes period of NIV just to keep him oxygenated, in that period also, this kind of tidal volume of 900 ml of 1000 ml will indicate a patient-induced self-inflicting lung injury. This will damage his lung in a very bad way. In emergency room, this patient was intubated in the 0 hour itself, once everything is assembled. What I mean to say, not every patient requires emergency intubation, but not all patient will go through the same phase of non-rebreathing mask, then HFNC, then NIV, then intubation. Few cases when they have a impaired consciousness, when they are in severe respiratory distress, when the PF ratios are less than 100, when they have shock, when they have organ failures, probably these are the patient who needs immediate 0 hour intubation in the emergency room itself, not giving any trials of NIV, not delaying the intubation just for the sake of any non-invasive trials will save these patients' lung, prevent self-inflicting lung injury in them. That is what is this flow chart says. If you need an emergency intubation, you should go for emergency intubation. Otherwise, if the patient is stable enough, you can try the other oxygen modalities. Coming to the case scenario 1, the patient who was stable on day 4 on HFNC in my high dependency unit, this patient slowly has started increasing requirement of FiO2 in even HFNC. We started with 60, but it's slowly gone to 80 with a flow requirement of 60 liters.
Hello?
Highest. Can you hear us, sir?
You are audible. You are audible. Please proceed.
Okay, please, rest of all can mute yourself. So the PF ratios remained 110 and the respiratory rate remained to be 35. And he was saturating with all these high FiO2, high flow rates, a saturation of 88, and he started irritable. He was started to have irritability. So at this point of time, we realized that this patient is getting further deterioration and worsening on HFNC and shifted to inside the intensive care unit from HDU. A discussion happened to intubate this patient and starting of invasive mechanical ventilation. See, this patient came to our hospital with a happy hypoxemia without any symptoms or signs, but on pulse oximeter, he was showing some hypoxia requiring a liter or two. Slowly, he progressed. In our clinical practice, we see many of our patients in this stage recover and go home without even requiring any further oxygen requirement by day 4 or day 6. But probably 20 to 30% of patients may go into this stage that they don't respond to our either antivirals, steroids, or low molecular heparin or oxygen supplementation, and they deteriorate in the hospital. I think the similar kind of experience you must have also seen. Few percentage of cases do deteriorate. Then the next question is, do we don't use NIV at all, or should I give an NIV trial? See, we do give NIV, we do use NIV. I will come to those controversies, but we use NIV trial only with dual limb NIV ventilators, not those portable single limb ventilator with the exhalation port outside exhaling to out. The biggest challenge in the initial part of our pandemic was whether NIV creates a lot of aerolization, and this aerolization can infect many of our healthcare workers was the initial concern. So we avoid a single limb NIV trial. We use dual limb ICU ventilator if available in a closed room, if available in a negative pressure room, but we don't have any negative pressure rooms. So we use a closed cabins with a dual limb, and the viral and bacterial filter, which is available in different ventilators in expiratory limb. And the general interface is a full face mask, oronasal full face mask. We also used helmets in very few cases, but we had a limited experience. There was a lot of patient discomfort with that. Even we initially thought the helmet will be the ideal interface, but we finally landed up in full face masks with a dual limb rather than helmets because of two reasons. One is limited supply and availability of helmet in the earlier part, and the different kind of discomfort in with the patients also. So where did we use NIV? In very selected patients where the family and the patient is very clear that the patient doesn't want to get intubated, with a pre-directive that in situations where I require an intubation, please do not intubate. Then hypercapnic respiratory failure with a known underlying type 2 respiratory failure diseases like COPDs or some underlying chronic lung disease having a type 2 respiratory failure, we preferred NIV. Cardiogenic pulmonary edema, see, we saw a lot of patients of cardiac patients landing up into mild COVID, but because of tachypnea, tachycardia, they decompensated the heart failure. And we also saw some of our CKD patients who are on regular dialysis because of the COVID co-infection. The COVID infection as itself may not be very severe, but during the process of mild to moderate disease, because of their underlying CKD, they land up into pulmonary edemas. So in these category of patients, we gave a trial of NIV, and NIV did really well in these patients, escaping intubation. But mind you, many of these patients where we used NIV, we gave a trial of 2 to 4 hours, and we made sure that there is an intensive care specialist who is staying beside the patient to monitor the oxygenation, the respiratory mechanics, the vitals. If my patient's oxygenation is improving, if my patient's respiratory mechanics looks better, if my patient's tachycardia, tachypnea, hypoxemia, hypercapnia, and hemodynamics are stable, then I do continue. If they get worse, probably I am not going to continue my NIV trial for a longer period. Probably I will not wait and intubate those patients. So we know the controversial related to the NIV, use of NIV, and this is still a controversial zone. Many institutions still do not prefer NIV as any mode of choice, but whenever you choose them, we choose bilevel ones, dual limbed ones, and we try to keep the driving pressures low. That means we know that many of these patients will require a good EPAP. Maybe we start with 5 EPAP and slowly go up to 6, 8, 10, 12 EPAP, but we make sure that the IPAP, uh, the inspiratory pressure above EPAP, the gap will not be very high. The low driving pressures may be between somewhere between 6 to 12 or 6 to 14, not a very high driving pressure, giving a lot of big tidal volumes, which can cause self-inflicting lung injury. What I mean to say is we keep EPAP little higher to make sure that we get good oxygenation, titrating the oxygen requirements, targeting around 92 saturations around. But we make sure that the EPAP is 6 to 8 or 10, but the IPAP, which is the gap between EPAP and IPAP, remains smaller, maybe 6 to 12. And we titrate FiO2 requirement to target a saturation of 92 to 94 in between them. And the failing FiO2 indications, the predictors which actually gives us a failing indicators, are if my patient generating a high tidal volume, somewhere between 10 ml per kilo, 9.5 ml per kilo. That means this is actually predicting excessive work of breathing, progressive worsening of your blood gases. If your ABZ, pH, CO2, O2 are worsening, work of breathing and necessary muscle use is higher, then you are in a NIV failure. Then the second important point which all of us are worried about, either to intubate early or delay. See, if you see the early part of the pandemic, everybody of us in the March and April, we thought these patients are very highly infectious, no NIV trials. If these patients come, put a tube, inflate the cuff, and continue a closed system of ventilation so that these patients will not spread aerolization. So early, we thought initially early. Then later on, we realized the patients who get intubated, the mortality rate may vary between 85, 90% to somewhere between 50%. So that was such a high mortality. Then they came with, no, do not intubate early. Many of these patients may not require intubation in so early. So just give a HFNC or NIV trial or non-rebreathing mask with oxygen trial so that you delay intubation. So you escape intubation and these patients may escape the disease and the mortality. So the point here is you should not be intubating any of these patients prematurely. Not all patients, like one of our case where these patients, we could actually wait for 4-5 days and given a trial. We know 80 to 90% of those category patients who just require few liters of oxygen may not progress to a intubation. They may improve by just supplemental oxygen or HFNC. But few cases where you know these patients are very sick, they may need immediate intubation. So just do not delay intubation for a NIV or HFNC trial if a invasive mechanical ventilation is indicated. As I told you, if a patient is in organ dysfunction, hemodynamically unstable, altered in mentation, very low PF ratio, very high work of breathing, very bad disease on CT, and the trajectory of the clinical course is very rapid. So probably these patients need to be intubated early. Do not wait in them. So avoiding intubation has shown to be a substantially better in prognosis. Patients who actually got better with non-invasive ways, either an NIV or a HFNC or on non-rebreathing mask, the mortality in them is remained very low. So you all prefer, or we all preferred, if I can escape an intubation and make my patient better without intubation, that is the best thing I should be trying. So the key factor in decision making whether to intubate early or late is the oxygenation, the respiratory distress and workup breathing, and the clinical trajectory. So if I put across indications for intubation, a rapid progressive disease over hours. If you admitted a patient over hours, you're seeing the patient is progressively worsening. Lack of improvement in spite of high flows, that is more than 50 liters or 60 liters per minute on HFNC with FiO2 requirement more than 0.7. Evolving hypercapnia, that is if the patient is retaining CO2, if the workup breathing is higher, and there is an increase in tidal volume. This has been one of those new things which we are evolving. If a patient is generating a lot of tidal volume of 900 ml, 1000 ml, then something is wrong in these patients. Worsening mental status, hemodynamic instability, new organ dysfunction. These are the at least indications where we think of that. Suppose once we decide the patient to be intubated, I think you all are experts in intubation. I will not go into the details of how do we intubate these COVID patients with aerolized patient precautions. I think you all are experts in that. So once I intubate this patient, then how do I ventilate? Again, calculate the predicted body weight, which we do. That is 50 plus 2.3 into the weight in the height in inches more than 5 feet for males, and 45.5 plus 2.3 in 2.3 into the inches more than 5 feet in a female. So what we generally calculate is if a patient is around 5 feet, you have a predicted body weight of 50 kilos, or if you add on body weight, you add the predicted body weight to that way. So you first calculate the predicted body weight. It comes 50 kilos, 60 kilos, 70 kilos according to your calculation. Then you select your ventilation strategy. If you select assist control mode, then your tidal volume calculation will come as 8 ml per kg body weight. If it is 60 kilo, 60 into 8. So the 480 mLs will be your predicted body weight related tidal volume to set with. So we generally talk about 6 ml per kilogram to start with, but in many of our in COVID situation, we started with 8 and then PEEP. We do not start with high PEEPs as we did with the severe ARDS cases. We started with 8 as a PEEP with the common norm to baseline to start with, and we adjusted respiratory rate to a target of CO2 of 45. We started respiratory rate somewhere between 20 to 18 and slowly gone up depending on our CO2 targets on an ABZ or ET CO2, targeting a CO2 of 45 and a minute ventilation somewhere between 6 to 8 liters. Then once I actually start this ventilation with a tidal volume of 8 ml per kg, PEEP of 8, respiratory rate adjusted to my PaCO2, then I look at a driving pressure. What is a driving pressure? The pressure which is required above the PEEP to generate this tidal volume. For example, if my plateau pressures are total of 20, then if I take out PEEP 8 out of it, then I left with 12. 12 was my driving pressure. So suppose if my plateau pressures are 30, if I minus PEEP of 8, my 22 is my driving pressure. So if my driving pressure is low like 12, then my lung is highly compliant. I continue with 8 ml. There is no need to decrease the tidal volume. But if my tidal volume, if my driving pressure is very high, that is somewhere between more than 15, that is 20, 25 or so, then probably I will not ventilate this with such a high tidal volumes. I will come down on tidal volume to 6 ml of predicted body weight from, as I said, if I have a 60 kg, I will come to 360 as the target tidal volumes in those patients. Then I look at the saturation. Whether my patient is saturating less than 90 and my PF requirement is less than 0.7, then I am fine, I'm okay. If my saturation are less than 90 and FiO2 requirement is more than 0.7, then probably I need to consider few things here. The first thing we look after is neuromuscular blockade agent. Many of you know for the intubation, we use neuromuscular blockade agent. But in ventilating this COVID patient, sometimes if my FiO2 requirement is more 0.7 and saturation are less than 90, we use neuromuscular blockade agent for 24 to 48 hours till we get a better saturations and that. And slowly the next thing what we do is try to increase PEEP2 at a time stepwise to see the best compliance. That is at which point my saturations are more than 92 and maybe the PEEP we slowly go up to 15 in those situations. Suppose after all this also my saturations remain less than 90 and FiO2 requirement remained very high, that is more than 0.7, then I look at compliance. How do I look at compliance? I look at tidal volume and driving pressure. Tidal volume by driving pressure. If that compliance is more than 40, if I see a very high compliant lung, then the recruitment in those patients will not work. Probably next thing I will do is proning them early. Suppose if my compliance is low, then probably I can try a higher PEEP ventilation and recruitment in them. For example, a CPAP of 40 for a 40 seconds or a CPAP of 40 for a 20 second and see whether I can recruit few of the lungs. Then if after all these, if the hypoxemia persists, then after the probably prolonged proning, I will try to change alternative modes of ventilation like APRV. If none of them working, then probably I will consider ECMO in them. So what is my goals of oxygenation in these patients when I am ventilating? I will not target very high PaO2. If my PaO2 in ABC is more than 60 and my saturations are somewhere between 88 to 92, I will be happy, not 98. And FiO2 requirement will be titrated to target around 88 to 92. And the tidal volume target will be around 4 to 8 ml and pH between 7.25 to 7.42, CO2 somewhere between 40 to 55. Troubleshooting. So once you actually set these ventilators, you set a tidal volume of 6 to 8 ml, you set a PEEP of from 8 to 15, and then you slowly up titrated your PEEP, you give a relaxant, you try to prone. After all this, suddenly you see your peak airway pressures goes very high, 35, 40, sometimes 45 or 50. What is the important thing you know? Many of you know how do you troubleshoot them. You look for any you look for some maybe a patient is biting the tube. You may look for some endotracheal kinking, tube kinking, or some cuff pressures and all that. But what I'm interested in these cases is many of these patients developed pneumothorax because of the leakage from the lung. We have seen pneumothorax. So never ever ignore these patients' high peak airway pressures. If a patient suddenly rapidly deteriorates and develops a high peak airway pressure, keep a watch on pneumothorax and try to, if you have an ultrasound on the bedside, you look for a pneumothorax or immediately do a chest X-ray, put a ICD. If there is a tension pneumo, probably finger thoracotomy or needle thoracotomy is the immediate way to go there. If plateau pressures are high, suppose you see a very high plateau pressures, so you consider the lung compliances is going down. So look for if you can go down on a tidal volume till 4 ml per kilogram. And then the next thing what you consider is whether you have some volume overload state, lung congestion, if you get lung wet. So consider a diuresis, consider a paralytics for a little longer period, adjust the respiratory rate to increase or to counterbalance that. So the other troubleshooting is if your oxygenation is worsening, then you probably will increase PEEP to a with on the as per the chart to make sure that the PEEP FiO2 chart to monitor your saturations and PaO2 so that slowly incremental PEEP from 8, 10, 12, see with which PEEP the patient is getting best oxygenation and proning as we saw, diuresis as we thought in hypoxemic patient. If a patient is acidotic, which kind of acidosis is developing, metabolic or respiratory. If respiratory, then adjust the rate accordingly. And if the patient has a high pH, make sure that you are decreasing the respiratory rate. If you have actually refractory hypoxemia, in spite of all this, if you have done a proning to improve the VQ mismatch and you have prolonged the proning, in spite of that, if your refractory hypoxemia is not improving, then always look for cardiac function. We saw many of these COVID patients has severe cardiomyopathy, severe myocarditis, RV dysfunction, and severe PAH. And this all has shown to actually worsen the patients. Patients are initially in a day or two, they were improving. Suddenly you see a dip in the overall function in them. These conditions need to be excluded. Then you can consider nitric oxide. We do not have any much experience with the use of nitric oxide to just improve the VQ mismatch, and continuing the paralytic agents beyond 48 hours also been tried. And we have sedated them with benzodiazepine and propofol in many of these situations. And if none of them probably work, the extracorporeal membrane oxygenation has also been used, and it has its own limitation in a resource limited settings. And these pandemic situations, we know this requires a lot of manpower and resources, but in situations where we could arrange, we actually did 10 to 12 ECMOs in them, but the results were mixed. We could actually succeed in 50% on them, but we lost a 50% of patients due to multiple complexities of ECMO in them. So with this, I actually thank the ISA Thrissur City Branch delegates. This is a vast topic of ventilating. We know every patient behaves differently. Every patient has its own idiosyncratic way of behaving to the ventilation. So we probably has to individualize this ventilation. This is a general way which we did. Thank you. Over to you, sir. Yes, sir.
Hello. Thank you, sir, for the.
Hello.
Hello.
Dr. Venkat, can you stop sharing?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful talk. Now I invite our next speaker, Dr. Paul Raphael, HOD of Amla Hospital, for our latest updates on ACLS DNA. We will have the discussions at the last. After that talk.
Good evening, all. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. Good evening, all, and I thank the Thrissur ISA for inviting me to speak on this hot topic. It is 2020 guidelines of CPR. This is by the American Heart Association, which has released last month. And you all know that the earlier one was in 2015, and the earlier one much before that was in 2010. From this picture, you can make out. And in between, in 2018, they had come out with an interim report. So my references are from the AHA document which was released last month. It is from the it is the highlights of the 2020 American Heart Association guidelines for CPR and emergency cardiovascular care. So for all the references from what I'm talking, you can go to this, you can visit this website, eccguidelines.heart.org. You will get all the resources from where which I'm speaking from. So you all know that this is chain of survival of in-hospital cardiac arrest and out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. This was released in 2015. So there is a change in the chain of survival. These are 5 links, and there is one more link added to that. That is the recovery in both the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and in-hospital cardiac arrest. That is because support is needed during recovery to ensure optimal physical, cognitive, emotional, and well-being and return to social functioning. So the HA has recommended that cardiac arrest survivors receive multimodal rehabilitation, assessment, and treatment before discharge from the hospital. So, but this should be initiated during the time of hospitalization and continue as long as needed. Now, coming to the other key changes, you all know the universal adult cardiac arrest algorithm that has been modified now. So there is emphasis on the early epinephrine administration for patient with a non-shockable rhythm. This was seen after they have seen that there is an improvement in the survival rate. And also about the amiodarone, you all know that the previous algorithm, those who know clearly will know that amiodarone is given in refractory ventricular fibrillation. That is 300 milligram is given. Now they have added lignocaine also, and they have considered it as equivalent as an antiarrhythmic in cardiac arrest scenarios. So that is the algorithm. In 2015, what you can see that epinephrine is given much later, and also amiodarone in the refractory shock. You can see only amiodarone here. Now the new one, if you see, there is, you can see the epinephrine is given as soon as possible because it improves the survival of the patient. And also here you can see the amiodarone and or lidocaine. So now both of them are added, and it is equivalent. So amiodarone is given 300 milligram as a bolus dose, and later repeated once, that is 150 milligram. Lidocaine is 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg. You can repeat it 0.5 to 0.75 milligram per kg. So that is the change in the cardiac arrest algorithm. Now, 2 new opioid-associated emergency algorithms are added. See, in US, many people are dying because of this opioid-associated emergency, but it's not there in India. There it is very common in US. So they have added for lay rescuer and also for the trained rescuers. So these 2 algorithm is added. These are added in infants and children also. In children also. Now, next key change is the post-cardiac arrest algorithm. You all know about the post-cardiac algorithm. It is followed after the return of spontaneous circulation. It is updated. So apart from prevention of hypoxia, hypertension, and targeted temperature management, there is a multimodal approach to neuroprognostication. So that is the algorithm of ROSC. You can see here, so one more change, what you can see is the SpO2. Earlier it was mentioned less than 94%. like you should try to keep it more than 94%. And now it is a wider range what they have mentioned, that it is 92 to 98%. And also to treat hypertension, what they had told was if the systolic blood pressure is less than 90. Now they have added the mean arterial pressure also as 65. And also one more thing in the targeted temperature management, you can see the EEG monitoring, which was not there in the earlier algorithm. And also about the percutaneous, they have given importance to the percutaneous coronary intervention. This has been pushed little higher up. Now, neuroprognostication should be performed no sooner than 72 hours after the return of the normotherapy. And this decision should be based on the multiple modes of patient assessment. So they have come out with a new diagram which represents the multimodal approach to guide neuroprognostication. So that is the diagram. What you can see, here on this axis, it's about the time after return of spontaneous circulation. This 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. And on this axis, you can see clinical management, imaging, electrophysiology, clinical examination, serum biomarkers. So everything is marked on this. Like the first 24 hours, what you have to do, that is the targeted temperature management. Later, you have to revamp, reduce the sedation. So go on. And what are the investigation, imaging you will have to do on each day? It's clearly been mentioned. So this gives a good indication and a guide for neuroprognostication, which is introduced in 2020. A cardiac arrest in pregnancy, that algorithm was earlier there, that has been updated. This is the algorithm. So you all know that they are more prone to hypoxia because of increased metabolism and decreased FRC due to the gravid uterus, and also the risk of fetal brain injury from hypoxemia. So you should prioritize on the oxygenation and airway management, and you should try to intubate this patient early also, and an experienced provider should be there for this. So during maternal resuscitation, what they say that fetal monitoring should not be undertaken because of the potential interference with the maternal resuscitation. But during targeted temperature management, that is indicated in whom the patient is comatose. During that time, you should always monitor, the fetal monitoring should be there for bradycardia because that is a potential complication. Regarding perimortem cesarean delivery, you should do within 5 minutes. What they mention is 5 minutes. Coming to the another key change, what they mentioned is the early initiation of CPR by the laypersons. So what was seen, like when they said about the hands-on CPR, what was seen that this for cardiac arrest patients, that layperson was reluctant to start or initiate the CPR because they were doubtful whether it is because of the whether it is a cardiac arrest or not. So what the HA has recommended that layperson initiate CPR for presumed cardiac arrest because the risk of harm to the patient is very low, even if the patient is not in cardiac arrest. So they say that there should be an early initiation of the CPR, which will increase the survival of the patient, improves the survival. Now coming to the route of administration. We all know that there is an earlier, what was mentioned, that IV access, that is intravenous access, and also intraosseous and endotracheal tube. So they were saying that IV and intraosseous are both equivalent, like whatever drugs you can give through intravenous can be given through intraosseous. Now, a 2020 ILCOR systematic review comparing IV versus IV administration showed that IV routes were associated with a better clinical outcome in retrospective studies. But if IV access is difficult, IO access, that is intraosseous, is an reasonable option. So like when you prefer, it should be an IV access, not an intraosseous. Now, regarding real-time audio-visual feedback, a recent RCT reported that there is a 25% increase in survival to hospital discharge when audio feedback was used. That was for the death and the recoil. So they recommended that it may be reasonable to use audio-visual feedback devices during CPR for real-time optimization of the CPR performance. Many like what I usually do is that I would download a metronome that is for the rate, and that has been proved to be efficient, because if you try to use to do the compression according to the metronome, the sound of the metronome, you will get the required rate. So that is always helpful. Now, symptomatic bradycardia, that is algorithm. There is the key change in that is about the dose of atropine, which has changed to 1 milligram from 0.5 milligram. Earlier it was 0.5 milligram. And also a dopamine infusion. When atropine is not working, then we'll have to go for the inotrope infusion. In that, dopamine infusion is there. What they mentioned is that instead of 2 to 20 microgram per kg per minute, we have to use 5 to 20 microgram per kg per minute. Now, physiological monitoring of CPR quality. See, how will we do that? That is by continuous measurement of intra-arterial BP or EtCO2, that is the end-tidal carbon dioxide tension. So, because it is directly proportional to the perfusion, you can know the quality of your CPR. How do you know that EtCO2? If it is less than 10, you all know that it's the normal range is 35 to 40. If it is less than 10, you'll have to improve your quality of your CPR. So try to be ideally to keep it above 20. There is no target been set even now. There is no the higher target set, but what they say, ideally it should be more than 20. Same case with the diastolic blood pressure. So it should be what they say, that it should be about 20. Try to increase to about 30. So by doing so, the perfusion is also that's an indirect measure of the perfusion. So if it is less, the perfusion is less, you can increase your quality of your CPR. So the recommendation is it may be reasonable to use physiological parameters such as arterial BP or EtCO2 when feasible to monitor and optimize the CPR quality. Now, double sequential defibrillation. This has been used, and this was the main thing in the last few years. What they say that it is a practice of applying two near simultaneous shocks, two shocks using two defibrillators. The recent 2020 ILCOR systematic review found that there is no evidence to support this. And also there is a risk of harm from increased energy, but you are giving from two defibrillators. So its routine use is not recommended. Now, coming to the pediatric basic and advanced life support, like a new pediatric chain of survival was created in infants, children, and adolescents. That is the 6th link recovery, the same like adults. And that is the 6th link. Before it was 5 links, now it is the 6th link. That is recovery, the reasons being mentioned before. And 2 opioid-associated emergency algorithm, one for the lay rescuers and trained rescuers. That's also been explained with an adult. And another thing is about the compression. Like for an infant, you do 2-finger compression when you're alone, and 2 thumb encircling hands compression when there are more rescuers. So what they say now is that 2 thumb encircling hands compression gives a better perfusion in infant, and that should be used instead of the 2-finger compression. Another change is about the pediatric post-cardiac arrest care. There is now a checklist being introduced in this. So that's the checklist. What has come up, it has an oxygenation, ventilation, hemodynamic monitoring, TTM, targeted temperature management, neuromonitoring, electrolytes, glucose, then about the sedation and the prognosis. So this is the new checklist which has come after the return of the spontaneous circulation. Now, coming to the ventilation rate. For infants and children with a pulse, but an absent or inadequate respiratory effort, it is recommended now that one breath every 2 to 3 seconds, that is 20 to 30 breaths per minute. The previous one was one breath every 3 to 5 seconds. So by increasing, it improves the survival. So the data shows that higher ventilation rates, that at least 30 per minute in infants and at least 25 per minute breath rate in children are associated with improved rates of return of spontaneous circulation and survival. When you're using an advanced airway in CPR, what was mentioned previously was one breath every 6 seconds, like 10 per minute. Now they are advocating one breath every 2 to 3 seconds. So these are the changes in the ventilation. And they have mentioned that you should use a cuff endotracheal tube. These are recommended because it reduces the air leak, but you should always be cautious on the cuff pressure. That should not go above 30. Use of cricoid pressure as it is no longer recommended. Epinephrine as in adults, like it should be given as early as possible. Use feedback from continuous measurement of intra-arterial pressure to improve the CPR quality. After return of spontaneous circulation, the patient should be evaluated for seizures, status epilepticus, and treated. Recovery, the same chain, actually, what is there in adult? It's continuous, should be that continuous long, after the initial hospitalization. That is the target time. It's not mentioned. They say it may go like about 1 year also. Neonatal life support, there are minor changes about the umbilical vein. The route of administration, what they say is the umbilical vein is a recommended route. You can catheterize also. If IV access is not feasible, then go for the intraosseous route. Termination of resuscitation. Earlier, the time was 10 minutes. It was mentioned. Now the reasonable time frame is mentioned is 20 minutes after birth. So during this time, you will have a chance to discuss in between, discuss with the other health workers and also the parents or the relatives about the condition of the patient. Human and system performance, that is about the booster training, which I'll come to you. The education, the resuscitation education science, they have introduced booster training and spaced learning approach. That is booster training. These are brief, frequent sessions focused on repetition of the prior content. So it will be repeated so that there will be a retention of the knowledge and skills. And spaced learning approach, that is the training is separated into multiple sessions instead of a single session. So it improves the retention of the CPR skills and also have greater effectiveness. So it is recommended to implement booster sessions and spaced learning approach for resuscitation training. In situ education, that is about simulation. It refers to training conducted in actual patient care areas. You all know that we are also practicing the simulation. Now, instead of the traditional training, simulation training is brought in. So advantages, you know that it gives a realistic training environment. There will be a positive impact on learning outcomes. They will be quick to perform the critical task, and the team performance will be much better. And also the patient outcome, that is, there will be an improved survival and neurological outcome. So it is recommended to conduct in situ simulation-based training, either alone or in addition to the traditional training. Thank you all for the patient hearing. And this is the website which I've told you. You can have the references from this. Thank you.
Hello. Am I audible? Hello. Am I audible? Hello.
Audible, sir.
Yeah. First of all, on behalf of Team ISA Thrissur, let me congratulate both Dr. Venkatramana and Dr. Paul for their fantastic presentations. Paul, we have heard from you earlier several times, but I personally am hearing Dr. Venkatramana for the first time. Dr. Venkatramana, I am so much impressed, and I'm sure that the whole crowd which has been listening to you would be having the same opinion of what I have today. It was a marvelous presentation done in the most simple way, and it couldn't have been better than this. So thank you both, Dr. Venkatramana and Dr. Paul. We have a few questions. There are two questions in the chat box, which I will read it now. I think both of them are to Dr. Venkatramana. And let me ask all of you, you are most welcome to ask questions on your own on the Zoom. You need not type down in the chat box. You can directly ask questions. But first of all, let me ask the two questions which have appeared on the chat box first. I think both of the questions are to Dr. Dr. Venkatramana. Dr. Venkatramana, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just read out the two questions in the chat box. What is the mortality rate in intubated COVID patients in your experience, and your experience of using Super PEEP in COVID patients?
Yeah, coming to the first question, the experience is little varied. When actually we tried to intubate the cases little early in the early part of our pandemic, we have seen ki we got somewhere between the mortality is 40 to 80%. It varied so rangely. Okay, the reason is we initially intubated all cases who were sick, and initially where PF ratios are less than 150, there was no experiments with NIV trials and HFNC. So those all patients gone for an early intubation, and we saw ki even with an early intubation, the mortality varied between 40 to 80. We have seen the experience of 70, 80 in a elderly comorbid group, and 40% even in a younger age groups. But later part, as actually we learned how to intubate, and we have learned how do we actually give a HFNC trial, NIV trial, and we could actually 70-80% of the patient we could escape intubation. But those patients who actually deteriorate on this NIV and they finally land off in intubation, we had seen a very higher mortality in them, somewhere between 60 to 70% also. So the mortality definitely remained to be higher comparatively what we saw with influenza or a bacterial pneumonia in them. So this is the experience of mortality related to the invasive ventilation. The second question is Super PEEP. So the Super PEEP is, what I understand, is higher PEEP. So we have two kind of PEEP tables. One is lower PEEP table. The other one is higher PEEP table. So a lower PEEP table is just a fractional FiO2 into 20. Suppose I deal with 0.4. So 0.4 into 20, that is 8 is my PEEP. If I deal with 0.8 FiO2 into 2016 is my PEEP. If I deal with 1 FiO2 into 2020 is my PEEP. That is maybe low or moderate PEEP table. Higher PEEP table, we add another 2 to 4 above that. So what we have realized is these lungs, when my lung compliance is good, very good, we try to use a lower PEEP model, somewhere between 8 to 12. But what we have seen is many of these patients, when we use a little higher PEEP, we have not seen any great benefit. But in fact, we have seen they landing up in surgical emphysema, pneumothorax, and they leaking the lungs, so requiring a ICDs and all. So our experience is higher PEEP has very limited value compared to a normal PEEP table. That is somewhere between 8 to 15, not beyond that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Venkatramana. There are
Dr. Nevin. Dr. Nevin.
Yes.
This is Dr. Shobha from Cochin.
Yeah, please go ahead, madam. Please go ahead.
Can I ask a question to
Dr.
Dr. Venkatraman?
Please go ahead, madam.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
Dr. Venkatraman, I'm Dr. Shobha from Cochin. I just want to know whether you use any type of scoring system to judge the failure of HFNO therapy, like ROC score or modified ROC score.
Yeah, yes. Actually, in the later part, we started using ROCs and modified ROC score. I'm deliberately actually avoided those scoring system just to make sure that we are only discussing about the ventilation. That has
Okay.
been validated widely, but our experience in the initial part was not much. But later we used the ROC score as a predictor of the success and failure with HFNC.
Yeah, and which do you think is better, the rocks or the modified rocks?
See, we used a modified ROCs.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you, doctor. Thank you.
There are two questions to Dr. Paul. How to get consent for do not attempt resuscitation? And can you save, second one is, can you save the newborn after 20 minutes? These are the two questions to Dr. Paul Raphael. Dr. Paul, please go ahead.
See, regarding the saving the newborn after 20 minutes, see why they have chosen 20 minutes is that they have come out with the studies that beyond 20 minutes, they'll have an hypoxic damage. So that is the reason why that 20 minutes is chosen. Regarding the consent, actually consent to do not attempt the resuscitation, that actually should be through a proper communication. Like it is not during the time of CPR, you should think about it. Like if you feel this patient is not salvage before itself, you should speak to the bystander, explain the thing, and we should come to a mutual consensus. Like in abroad, see that they have tags saying that do not resuscitate. Some that is not seen here, and do not resuscitate is not legally like acceptable here also. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. Sir, two more questions to you, sir. What is your preferred muscle relaxant during mechanical ventilation? And do you practice any lung recruitment maneuver in between the ventilation?
Yeah, so the muscle relaxant which we used is atracurium most of the times. And in between, when we saw the patients recover very frequently, then we used vicodinium intermediately. But the most common one used is atracurium, and that too in infusions whenever we wanted a long term. But that we restricted only for 24 hours to 48 hours. Later on, we tried to discontinue and put them onto a good amount of sedation and used relaxant SOS. To intubate, all of the times we used rocuronium as a choice. So that is our institutional practice: intubation with rocuronium, maintenance and infusion with atracurium. SOS if the patient very frequently recovers back and have a problem in proning, we use it with. The second question is recruitment related question. As you see, the recruitment is maneuver itself is in controversy. If you see the recent trials, it may not give a long-term benefit. It may temporarily improve your oxygenation. But the biggest question which we have to answer in COVID lungs is my lung recruitable? Is my lung recruitable? If my lung is very compliant, my compliance are very high, and because of the COVID pneumonia, without any collapse and atelectasis, my lung is not able to generate and gas exchange and VQ mismatch. In those situations, probably your recruitment will not help. But if my lung compliances are very bad, if I am requiring very high pressures to generate even 6 ml per kilogram of tidal volume, then we use a recruitment maneuver. And recruitment maneuver, like any other ARDS, will give us probably a temporary improvement in oxygenation. And we did recruitment maneuver in poorly compliant and very bad compliant lungs. The only risk we encountered is these patients develop more pneumothorax, more surgical emphysema compared to the other ARDS related to influenza or other pneumonias.
Okay, and how often LFT and RFT were repeated?
See, the initial day one, we actually do all the organ functions, including LFT, RFT. If a patient is on a ventilator and the organ functions are stable, on the subsequent days, we repeat them on every 48 to 72 hours. But if they are in worsening trend, so we repeat daily. Otherwise, we only repeat every second to third day, depending on the patient's need. Otherwise, we don't do it on a daily basis.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any more questions to be asked? I think somebody there is some audio disturbance from somebody who is. Please do mute your uh, uh, Zoom. Like there is some disturbance. Dr. Veena has complained that there is some disturbance. So anybody who is unmuted and not asking questions, please do mute. Any more questions to be asked? Any more questions? Anybody has got any questions to ask?
Uh,
Hello.
I think there are no
Any?
more questions.
See, ISA Thrissur is very much pleased, and we are so happy that we could present this topic before you. All those for the kind information of all the people attending this Zoom meeting. You're most welcome to let us know that if you want any particular topics to be discussed, and if there are many takers, we can arrange particular or presentations of particular topics. There are a few. I think there are two questions. There are two questions from Dr. Shamila, and that regarding post-COVID complications, and how often you were doing suctioning. That is from Dr. Veena. Dr.
See,
Venkatramana.
yeah, because of the risk of exposure and aerolization, we use most of the time closed suction system. Even though it may not be feasible in all the time, all the centers, but we try to use closed suction system. It adds another 1200 to 1500 rupees to the patient, which comes for maybe 72 hours to 90 hours. So the suctioning frequency is not mandatory and standard on COVID patient. If my patient has no visual secretions, we do only suctioning SOS every 4th hourly, not in a routinely regular basis. And the the suctioning system, we try to continue with the closed suction system for two reasons. One is to avoid aerolization. The other one is to probably not to allow the patient to de-recruit. So closed suction system do help us continuing the recruitment or continuing the PPET itself.
Does just chest physiotherapy help? That is another question from Dr. Veena.
Yes.
Ideal duration of CPR. I think that is to Dr. Paul.
Yeah. So the chest physiotherapy is been done in all the patients. See, these physiotherapies, even though the initial part, the respiratory therapist, physiotherapist remained to be little apprehensive, scared about the exposure and the transmission. Later on, obviously over a time, everybody now is participating. Yes, it plays a very important role because we see a lot of critical illness polyneuromyopathy in them because of both steroids and the neuromuscular blockade agent. So we do ask physiotherapy, limb physio, chest physio, rehabilitation in patients who are actually, we start it after 24 or 48 hours. Once the patients are out of muscle relaxant, we try to encourage physiotherapies early in them.
Ideal duration of CPR to Dr. Paul.
Okay, it depends on like if you are alone or if you are working as a team. If you are working as a team in a hospital, there should be a time fixed. Like usually in our hospital, it is 25 to 30 minutes, but it all depends on the patient whether it is salvageable. If patient is salvageable, we will go beyond that. If not salvageable, we'll stop that. And if you are alone, like what you have to think is that like you should stop when you are fatigued. Okay, that is the point you should know. Otherwise, you will also be lying down next to the patient. So ideal time of the CPR in the hospital where I am working is 25 to 30. It depends on the patient, how the condition of the patient. It can be extended or it can be decreased.
There is one more question related to post-COVID
complications.
Yeah, sir. That we are seeing a good number of post-COVID complications. It is very surprised to see a wide horizon of post-COVID complication, from the lung parenchyma, fibrosis, effort intolerance, persistent hypoxemia, and critical illness polyneuropathy. Then myocardial ischemia with coronary syndrome, even bowel ischemia with mesenteric thrombus, CVAs, many wide horizon of post-COVID syndromes related to the delirium, dementias, many post-COVID syndromes we are seeing. So these are divided into lung, pulmonary, and non-pulmonary both.
Next one is IM epinephrine has got any role, Dr. Paul?
No, not at all. It is not mentioned in any of the resuscitation team, and it is not effective. That is the reason why it is not mentioned.
Any more questions? Any more questions to be asked? Friends, I think you can. We will give you Dr. Arun Krishna's number and his details. You are most welcome to suggest a few topics if you want, so that we will try to arrange. I think there is one more question to Dr. Paul. ET tube epinephrine in neonatal resuscitation.
Okay, say if there are there are three routes being mentioned. Three routes mentioned. That is, one is intravenous, second one is intravenous, and the third one is the endotracheal. If you are intubated, you will have to give two and a half times the normal dose, and only 4-5 drugs can be given through that, and epinephrine is one of them.
Dr. Arun has already mentioned this mobile number. You can please intimate us regarding good topics which we would like to hear, and we will try our best to get the best speakers possible to give you more academic sessions. I think, shall we, if there are no more questions, I think we will wind up the session. In between, let me inform the ISA Thrissur.